Janka, just take us through some of the guidelines and perhaps some of the deadlines that would be put in place. I mean, what kinds of powers will this kind of committee have to stop the kinds of things happening that we've seen unfolding over the past months?
Well, that's going to be some of the questions that will need to be answered if the summit finally takes place in February. As we heard in those clips, some of the things they will touch on, and then later they also mentioned that Parliament will also need to assist them if there is any legal processes that they will also need to follow in order to make sure that whatever they decide on, whichever basically accountability system they put in place, that this can actually make a difference in the religious sector. Obviously, though, there are some religious groups or leaders that are not necessarily part of the group who are here today. For example, your pastors that we've seen who did not want to take part in this process. The religious leaders here today saying why, the question must be asked why they do not want to be part of this process. But these who were here today, they said they represent millions of South Africans, and they all believe that while there is a freedom of religion in South Africa, you have to hold some people accountable because you're dealing here with people's faith. And some of the religious people here making it clear that this is often seen as a power that is, or abuse of power, and that is a type of abuse of power that's really difficult to not only detect, but also there's no systems in place to deal with this. And if I could just make an example of one of the stories that the pastors used as an example, is he said that if a young girl goes to her pastor and she says she can't conceive, or they're having trouble to conceive in their marriage, you have sometimes pastors going and saying that, well, I spoke to God and God told me that if you sleep with me, then you will have children. And obviously these are young, vulnerable women often who really have faith in their pastors, in God. So it's really a sensitive and emotional aspect to deal with in the religious sector. So it's going to be difficult going forward. But after what we've seen in the country, the religious leaders saying here today that they are really sorry that they've waited this long to actually address this. But from next year, or actually from today, but specifically after the summit, the religious sector, according to them, will never be the same.
I mean, some of the disturbing facts that have come out of the various stories we've heard about so-called dodgy churches over the past months is this issue of unregistered places of worship. And we heard one alarming figure, 140,000 unregistered places of worship. Now, part of what the CRL is proposing is sort of a code of conduct, aside from the fact that you have to be registered, a code of conduct of how these places of worship should conduct their business. And surely that will form a big part of that summit next year.
Yes, that is correct. And what the CRL Commission today is saying is they're not leading this process, but they are supporting it. Because in that report that detailed some horrific things that have been happening in this religious sector last year, they recommended basically a peer review mechanism so that there is a way for churches to hold each other accountable and for them to come together, and the religious leaders themselves taking the lead to develop, as you've mentioned, maybe some sort of code of conduct, some sort of accountability system that can be in place so that you can either also register those who want to be registered, but also that people can know and can ask questions if they do have concerns about the religious leaders they might follow, or if they have any suspicions of that about something that is happening, then there is something in place, or a system in place at least, where they can go to, where they can have where they can raise their questions so that these things can be addressed. As we stand now, there is no such system in place, so these have been basically allowed to flourish, but this has to stop. The Commission and the religious leaders saying that they need to work together, starting by saying that they had their challenges at the start because some people felt that the Commission was interfering in a sector they weren't supposed to. But the fact is, this needs to be done for those people who are being exploited and those people who are being abused. So now they've decided that they do have to work work together if they want to bring an end to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for that update. Our reporter Janka Tolme was at that briefing. Leaders of various religious groups deciding to convene a summit that's happening in February, taking a look at various issues in that community.